measuring stick when it comes to history, one that's been popularized over many periods of time whenever you talk about history's moments or movements, and to talk about great individuals that defined those historic moments. Now, I don't find much substance to that, but two individuals that drive a hard case against my opinion are the penultimate figures of the two phases of ancient Rome. The Republic, known for its citizen army that went on to conquer all of the Italian peninsula before pacifying the Mediterranean as a Roman lake. The king of the hill society built up within that Republic period, where one's place in society is not just for the present, but helps define the status for subsequent generations by what glory they were able to achieve for all of Rome. The pace of that culture, of continued glory-seeking and praise, started to become a victim of its own success. It drove the ability to pacify the Italian peninsula and all of the Mediterranean, but it started to create little quirks. Any number of individuals could have been the one who came up on top of this race, but the one who did is undeniably the most famous of all the Romans, Julius Caesar. A man who Will Durant said was one of the most complete individuals in all of history, for his ability to speak, write, maneuver in politics, wage war at a genius level, not to mention foster relationships that boded him very well. Just like the Republic he sprung from, he was a victim of his own success and ultimately naming himself as sole ruler for life, which caused his assassins to conspire against him. The next phase ancient Rome entered after the Republic wasn't immediately following Caesar's death. There's a little bit of a gray period. The time from the civil wars with Caesar crossing the Rubicon into Rome becoming an empire firmly established is a bit opaque as to what the government would be and how it would turn out. Would it keep carrying on, or it become something new? That is until another giant of history, and Julius Caesar's great-nephew, Augustus, came along and formed it. Augustus, by the way, a name he gave himself. He remade the Republic into an empire through thousands of smart decisions and learning from what went wrong over the course of his long career. Starting off with luck, and in many ways misfortune, of being adopted as Caesar's son, Augustus truly made a name for himself far away from any nepotism. Though his name isn't known very much outside of the heady history nerds like myself, despite in his time being lauded. He reformed the government for good or ill, taking that king of the hill society that everyone jumps on top of the other to rise to the top, to a society of administrators of the empire. Albeit now there's a new position, that of emperor, for people to fight over. Augustus found the government bloody and beaten, and turned it into a well-oiled empire. Just as he famously said, "I found Rome built of bricks, and leave her clothed in marble." He largely did something similar to the government, even if he was a part of some of that bloodiness. I think it's objective that individuals are a result of the context of their time. How they navigate that time is ultimately how they create an impact. Learning from these historic giants may seem a bit strange, given that their time was of pungent smells and gladiator battles, but human nature doesn't change all that much, and we might end up finding a lot the same if we were to go back into time, even though so much would be repulsive to us. In the context of these two, Augustus was the genius known more in his time but lost to history, largely because he was too banal. He didn't die gloriously, but in his own bed on his own terms. Then you have Julius Caesar, who is frustratingly competent in damn near everything. Augustus' time being defined by decades of civil war defined his legacy and how he was able to turn it into an empire pseudo-monarchy more than anything else. Unpacking these two individuals is what the topic of this episode is about, with Adrian Goldsworthy, a historian and novelist who specializes in ancient Roman history. In this, we discuss Julius Caesar and Augustus, if Rome was likely inevitably moving to something more like a monarchy by nature of what it had achieved, and what it was like to be living in ancient times, as well as what we can learn from it. Along with that, we get on a topic of how ancient Rome is much more similar to us today, in a way we would understand more than we would expect. A lot of it is shocking, but after you get past that, you can start spotting the similarities. Thank you very much, Adrian, for coming on the show. Thank you all for listening. wherever this finds you on our big, blue, beautiful planet. I'm wishing you the best. All right, I gotta do that cliche thing before the episode starts. If you like what you're hearing, please follow the show on whatever platform you're hearing it through. And if you would, give us a rating as well, as both of those help keep the show going and get it found. One last thing, if you want to submit a topic for me to cover, throw me a person you want me to interview or talk with, even if you want to talk with me, or you just want to tell me how terrible of a job I did on something, check out bandwidth.productions to visit the site and drop us a note. Cool. Well, thank you again. Adrian, would you mind introducing yourself pretty quick?
To you or to the audience? Sorry.
To the audience, yeah.
Oh, right. Hello, I'm Adrian Goldsworthy. I'm an ancient historian, and I've written mostly on the Romans, but sometimes on the Greeks and the other cultures of the ancient world, and every now and again I dabble in fiction as well. But basically my day job is writing ancient history.
Cool. I am very excited to talk to you, as I was just saying. But before, the first question I always ask guests when they join is, what do you like to do that makes you happy?
Oh, simple things, really. I mean, I'm never happy unless I know either that I've started a book or that I've got the next one lined up that I'm going to read. Whatever it is, doesn't matter. And mostly when I'm working, it has to be relaxing stuff, something light, because you can't go too heavy if you're studying all the way through. But no, I like a sense of space. I live in a small town on the coast, so you can look to the horizon. Even from my office, if I turn to the left, you can see out to what's called the Bristol Channel, and then there's the coast of southwest England the other side. It's that sense of space. I couldn't work in a city. I just couldn't cope with that. The crowds, the noise, and not feeling shut in. So yeah, it's simple things, I think.
That sounds lovely. Yeah, my wife took me out of a city, tooth and nail, and now that I live in a countryside along the coast of Lake Michigan and in a forest, I couldn't go back. It's kind of funny. What's your next? Do you have your next book lined up already that you're working on?
Yeah, I'm writing a book. I did a biography of Philip II and Alexander the Great a couple of years ago, a joint biography. And when I was writing that, I really wanted an accessible account of the 5th century BC and the rise of Athens and Sparta. And there wasn't one. There's books on the Persian War, there's books on the Peloponnesian War. But I'm trying to explain in this book who the Greeks were, what these two cities were like, and how different and similar they were to all the other Greek communities, of which there are about 1,000 of these little city-states around, and tell the story, how you go from standing shoulder to shoulder and fighting the great enemy, the great invader Persia, to within a couple of generations, both of you are desperate to take money from the Persians to fight other Greeks. So how does all that happen? That's the story I'm trying to tell. So as I say, there was a book that I thought ought to have been there and isn't, so I'm having a go at writing it.
Oh, that sounds great. Yeah, I've read both of your books on Augustus and Julius Caesar, and I've actually been wanting to read your one on Philip and Alexander because, I mean, much like what we're going to get into, hopefully, is Augustus is kind of the unsung hero of the two of them. Philip is the same way with Alexander, which I think is interesting. I like that you put those two together in a single book.
Yes, I wouldn't have. I mean, there's a book on Alexander, at least one every year. New, but it rarely tells very much. And I thought I didn't want to do that because I thought a lot's already been said. But if you actually look at the two men together and compare them and see, nearly all of Alexander's soldiers, let alone his senior officers, are Philip's men. And they've served with his father for 20 years. We have this idea, Alexander the Great, the genius who takes over and just sort of, smiles, his teeth glint, and everybody falls in love with him and wants to serve him and fight to the ends of the earth. But actually, you feel he's got to prove himself in those early years because you've got all these tough men in their 30s, their 40s and older who've, they've seen it all, done it all, and they're not about to be impressed by this kid who's 21, so I think we can step back and put people in their context, and then we understand them better.
Oh, certainly. Yeah, I think it's one of the great things that good historians do. I'm a big fan of Plutarch, and to tie it back to Julius Caesar, he compared the two of them together, and it's always that interesting. Who knows if the story is true of Julius Caesar weeping when he was 30 or so, and considering how much Alexander had done at the same period of time and how little he was in comparison. But the thought I always have is, well, he was given an army that was already proved to be the best in Anatolia, and then he just had to run with it and prove himself, not to get mutinied or assassinated himself.
It's sometimes easier when you're young as well, because you can believe you can do anything. As the years pass, your edges get sort of knocked off a bit, and you generally. But when you're 20, 21, that sort of age, yeah, I could change the world. I could do that, and especially if you've been brought up, in a palace as the heir to the king, and you are very capable.
Yeah.
I mean, writing a biography of Julius Caesar, it does make you feel a little bit inferior because this man can seem to do anything and has this style. He even writes a manual on grammar, for goodness sake, which hasn't survived but was reasonably well thought of. It's the idea of just being able to be very good at these practical things, but also very good intellectually as well, and have style and all this sort of thing. They're probably not easy people to be around, but they sometimes make you think, oh, well, perhaps I should do a bit more and make more effort.
Most certainly. Yeah, no. And I mean, even though the grammar, book he wrote didn't survive, his Gala campaigns being the essentially used for Latin grammar to this day is fascinating. And that actually really, both those things really tie into the first question I wanted to ask you. So, Will Durant, who's another historian who, he talked about how he liked to write in synthetic history. So like, synthesis. And he had a really pithy line about Julius Caesar. And he said that he's often considered one of the most complete individuals in history because he had showcased ability in, so many things like military leader, orator, politician, writer, intellectual. Maybe you agree with this. I'm kind of already leading you from what you said, but having studied him and, written a biography of him and, so other people so closely, would you agree that he stands above a bunch of others in history as being so gifted in so many areas?
He certainly was, but he strikes me as rather like Winston Churchill in that he does so much to. It's not just that he has that way with words. You get, you read something Churchill wrote when he was 19, 20, and the English is so good. And this was someone who wasn't considered capable at school or anything like this, but, writing for newspapers and then turns it into a book. With Caesar, you have the same thing, but basically it's his version of all that happened is the one we remember. We know his campaigns, and I'm sure most commanders in history would prefer to be judged on, oh yeah, that's what I said, that's how I did it, and something bad happened, but that wasn't really my fault. That was, unforeseen circumstances or somebody else's problem. So there's an element where you have to be a little bit skeptical, but they were remarkable individuals. I mean, they have opportunities that are of the moment. There are Caesar is able to get this exceptional command in Gaul because the politics is fairly volatile at the time, and he allies with Crassus and Pompey and has the backing. But then he goes and grabs this opportunity with both hands. So it's that element of, yes, he's lucky, as he boasted, as every Roman commander or Roman leader says that they are. It's like Sulla Felix, Sulla the lucky. This sense that you needed good luck because that implied some sort of destiny or divine fortune or something like that, depending on how a lot of them seem to be fairly cynical religiously, but there was this sense of something greater that gave them the opportunity. But with Caesar, he does it so well when he gets there, and it is pretty spectacular. I mean, you can't take away from the fact that this chap was really good at whatever he did. On the other hand, of course, he does get murdered, so there's clearly something he doesn't read the room quite as well as perhaps he might have done. So I think there are. It's obviously terribly unfashionable these days to have the idea of the sort of the great man or the great woman, this individual who changes an era. The problem is when you look at how history plays out, they are clearly there. Doesn't mean that other people aren't important as well, that there's lots of other factors going on, that there isn't that moment in time where these things are possible in a way they weren't. But the Caesars, the Napoleons, the Churchills even, for good or ill, they do make a difference.
Yeah, and even though he was in a land of, a time of giants with everyone else that was competing against him, that maybe the fact that he was competing forced him to rise above even more, which is an interesting thought.
It is. I mean, even if you're playing a sport or something, you learn more by playing people better than yourself.
Oh,
because
totally.
You have to try and improve. If you're the best around and hammer everybody easily, then you don't tend to stretch. So, at a simple level, there's probably that happening as well, as you say.
Yeah, without a doubt. Yeah, I would imagine. Julius Caesar's heir, who we know in history as Augustus, is far lesser known at our time, which I thought it was great that you even say in your introduction, if I'm not mistaken, how part of your reason of writing that was to highlight a bit more of him.
Hmm.
Um, you know, my question then is: was Augustus as well known in the ancient world as, or was he in the shadow of his great uncle? And to kind of conjoin another question with that one, do you think Julius Caesar would be as infamously known today if it wasn't for Augustus and his fantastic ability to kind of set the means of an empire and going forward, as opposed to Julius Caesar, who did a bunch of great reforms but never solved the issue of having a single person in command without getting assassinated, as you said?
Well, Caesar's not there for very long. The civil war's going on most of the time. He has supreme power, but it's certainly true. We forget that Caesar was just a family name. He's so that he can say, "I'm not king, but Caesar," because Rex King was another family name. But Augustus really is the person who makes the name of Caesar synonymous with power. Because when you think after him, all the emperors that come for those centuries, they use the name Caesar, they use the name Augustus. So, really, in the ancient terms, Augustus is the bigger figure because he is far more successful. And he's the one who sets up this regime that even later emperors, Vespasian, who'll succeed after Nero's death and the civil war that follows, calls himself a Caesar. So he's taken a family name. It's like deciding if you were prime minister in Britain to call yourself, I don't know, Churchill or Gladstone or something, because you take one of these figures from the past. It's why you have a Kaiser in Germany, a Tsar in Russia in the early part of the 20th century still. It becomes this something that has nothing whatsoever to do with your actual descent. Augustus does that. Remember, Augustus is left as last man standing in 30 BC. Antony's killed himself. There are no more warlords around. He dies 44 years later and has ruled for that period. So there's hardly anybody left who can remember what had come before. Caesar is this sort of bright star that blazes, but it doesn't last very long and is very much part of that Republican generation, that old aristocracy of doing things. Whereas even though Mark Antony dismisses the young Augustus as he'll become as a boy who owes everything to a name, it's the fact that he has the name Caesar makes his career possible, that he has Caesar's money and gains Caesar's connections. Without that, this 19-year-old couldn't have done anything. That's not the way the Roman system works. He was able to rally troops to him, and he had that ability to do a lot, but also to learn from his mistakes. There's a lot of trial and error early on. But he's the man who goes on and creates the Principate, this rule of one, the rule of the princeps, the first servant of the state, first magistrate, first of the Senate. And that's what lasts. So actually, it's Augustus. And if you think Caesar was the first living Roman to appear on coins, his image would be there, whereas other people, their names had appeared, but no one else before had actually put their head or to themselves. But it's only some of the coinage. Augustus's name or symbols are on every silver and gold coin minted in the empire from then on. And his image is everywhere. And it's an image, in his case, that never ages. All the statues of him, all the pictures of him, of this eternally youthful, rather perfect, serene-looking figure. Whereas the images we have of Caesar are, you show his receding hairline, you show the sort of rather grizzled look. So even if you think in the biblical context, the story about Jesus being asked, should you pay tax? Bring me a coin. Whose head's on the coin? Caesar. Even though that story is set in the reign of Tiberius, the odds are the image would be of Caesar Augustus, because so much currency was minted and is in circulation for a very long time afterwards. And probably if you're in the provinces, it's very hard to tell one emperor from another because they're all called Caesar and they all get the title Augustus pretty soon. So I think he is far more significant. It's just that the sources for him aren't so good. He didn't write anything that's been preserved in the same way that Caesar did. And of course, because he's so successful, we're coming back to what we said before, there's not this supporting cast of Cicero, of Pompey, of Crassus, of Cato the Younger, of all these similarly spectacular individuals. They've really gone. What you get with Augustus is his wife Livia, you get the sort of Robert Graves, I Claudius, machinations and palace intrigue. But you don't really have, when you think of Agrippa, his sort of right-hand man, is hardly known today at all. Very successful individual, consul umpteen times, wins all sorts of victories, never accepts a triumph, just goes and does the job and gets on with it. Not known at all. So it's a sign of success, really, that almost he becomes boring. And It's why he doesn't get a Shakespeare play. He gets to die in his bed. So what's dramatic about that? It's whereas being murdered or committing suicide like Caesar or Mark Antony is far better stuff for the stage.
That's I really appreciate that. So it's wild to think about how well known he was at the time, but maybe because he was so well known, it was a bit banal, and it didn't shine as bright, even though his impact was arguably greater. Uh, that's really interesting to think about.
It's the same. I mean, how many stories, whether it's in on screen or whatever, they're more exciting if there's crisis and often more dramatic if there's failure.
Oh yeah,
Living to a ripe old age, living almost happily ever after, not quite, but nevertheless, it's duller stuff, and but it doesn't help that so many of the sources that were there in the ancient world haven't survived. So we've got far more, we've got all of Cicero's letters, or a lot of them. We've got his speeches, we've got Caesar, we've got then Plutarch's lives, but all the exciting ones are basically in the Republic. And then because you could do more, Roman aristocrats later just don't get the attention. I mean, Plutarch did a couple of the emperors who have these short-lived reigns after Nero's death, but there's hardly anybody bothers to read those lives. They're just a lot less exciting than the ones from earlier.
Yeah, I bet it's a bit of human nature to be drawn to whatever is most chaotic or salacious. It's also, I mean, going back to Alexander, would he be as considered the great if he would have lived into an old age? I mean, something tells me trying to figure out how to govern that big of an empire would have been the death of him in some way, of if not just fading into obscurity.
That's the thing, he's perpetually young because he didn't live long enough to age. Augustus is a man in his 70s later on, but Alexander he's sort of the ideal youthful Western hero. You can see it reflected in portraits of people like T. Lawrence and this sort of thing. The sort of the pale eyes, the stare. It's great, this emphasis on youth and being quite frail, apparently, as well, but somehow really good at fighting. So I think it is. It's obviously we all want success, and we probably all want a dull life that's prosperous, but it isn't a good story.
Yeah, in the startup tech world that I spend most of my time in, I've always found that the people you need to start a company are different than the people you need to expand it, are different than the people that you need to run it when it's an enterprise. It's all, you need different types of people. It's as rarely do you find somebody that is able to do all of those different things. Is there a similar analog with what I said to Caesar, Julius Caesar and Augustus, where you needed the Julius Caesar to come in and kind of consolidate power, to make some reforms that were desperately needed, and then you need somebody like Augustus to come in and say, okay, well, let's solve this whole we can't have a king thing, and instead create this different office and really create this imperial order where instead of the aristocracy is fighting to be the best and have all this glory and conquest, they're more of a an aristocracy in the way we would think of more nowadays, where they're going for governmental prestige, and you're going to go be the leading one of the provinces, as opposed to going and conquering a new area.
One thing you've always got to remember is that there are 14 years from Caesar's assassination until the end of the civil wars. There's 14 years of chaos and death, and all the big names, all those people we've talked about, the Ciceros, the Catos, all of these people die violently at their own hands or someone else's. Being one of the prominent men in the late Republic was not a good long-term prospect. So the situation is different. And personally, you can never prove it. And there was a tradition in the ancient world of Caesar's opponents that he was always aiming for supreme power because he wanted to be in charge and do things. I don't think he did. I think this largely happened accidentally. He would have been content to be the most distinguished member of the state. I think his ambitions were quite traditional, just big, and felt that he looked around and thought, well, I'm better than most of these people. I really deserve to be on top. However, once he is dictator, the amount of energy he throws into trying to sort out problems in 46 BC, and there's only a couple of stints actually in Rome, down to things like reorganizing the calendar, for goodness sake, and creating something that with minor modifications is what we're using today, 2,000 years later. That's pretty staggering. So Caesar has a talent for getting things done. And I think if there had been more time, he probably would have been successful. Augustus' experience is different. He's coming into a republic that he and his generation can see quite clearly isn't working. They're just slaughtering each other all the time. There's no stability. For people in the provinces, it's incredibly confusing because they just never know who's in charge. Where do I go if I've got a problem and I need to ask the Romans? You could look at somebody like Cleopatra, who is staunchly loyal to the alliance with Rome throughout her life, but keeps up ending up on the wrong side in civil wars. And but as she tried to say to Augustus when Antony's dead, she waits that more than a week after Antony's killed himself, trying to cut a deal. Look, I've always given you what you want, or what the Romans want. What they've asked me, here it is. I've used my kingdom for your benefit. So there's been that element of chaos, which means it's different with Augustus. But I think there certainly is a pattern, and there's also a very conscious change in the way Augustus behaves. Comes back to this idea that he can learn. I don't think he starts off with this brilliant idea. This is what I'd like the state to be. I'm going to do this, that, the other. I'll put myself in charge. I'll organize things this way. I'll, expand the involvement in politics, but I'll curb elections. I'll do all. It's much more trial and error. And if you look at the early 20s BC, for a while his power is really blatant. He seems to be, there's some archaeological evidence from building this really grand palace on the Palatine Hill, where we get the word from, that would have been approached from the opposite side of the hill to the Forum. And he's consul every year. There's a story he's playing with the idea of calling himself Romulus, the founder of Rome, rather than then chooses Augustus instead. From 23, that he steps back, and it's a much more veiled system of power. So he has the powers of a proconsul, a former proconsul. He has the rights of a tribune, the tribunes that have always protected the Roman people against abuse by magistrates. So he's not there at the center. And he also, even to the point where now he changes, so the approach to his house actually comes along a road that passes all the big houses of the aristocracy. So you're still at the top of the hill beyond them, but you're part of the same system. So there's almost sort of physical way. So he learns, he makes mistakes, but learns from them. One of his great skills is in finding talent. And you can see this in terms of people like Agrippa, who is perfect as far as Augustus is concerned, because he's from an obscure family, so can't get too ambitious himself, but he's just really good at doing things. You can put him in charge of a navy, and he learns how to do that. He teaches the rowers how to row by setting up sort of benches on shore, training them that way before you go to battle. He can command an army. When you have a problem with the water and drainage system of Rome, you put him in charge of that. He rows a boat around the sewers, supervises the repair, the expansion of that, so you get better water, cleaner water. He's got that knack, but he always is happy to do it and give all the credit to Augustus. And he's lucky with his family, his stepsons Tiberius and Drusus, later Germanicus, some of the others. He can use people who will go off and do things, so you don't have to trust an aristocrat who might get a little bit too ambitious. But there's clearly a pattern, although there's probably a problem. I mean, he begins with the whole of society being so exhausted. You've only got to read Virgil or Propertius or any of the poets. There's that sense of, when will I know that I'm going to wake up tomorrow morning and my farm will still be my own? It won't have been confiscated and given by some warlord to his troops. Or what's happened to the friend of mine who vanished, got caught up in the wars and never came back? There's just this longing. They want peace. They want stability. They're exhausted because the old system just hasn't been working, and it's been too damn dangerous to be anywhere near public life or just have wealth. You're there as a target. So he draws on that. He gives them what they want. If you go to Rome today, you can see the Ara Pacis Augusti, the altar of Augustan peace. Now, in fact, Augustus's reign is marked, other than 2 years, by constant overseas wars. But they're against foreigners. The peace he gives them is peace internally. Roman isn't fighting Roman anymore. We're done with that. We're going back to the old customs, the old traditions. So I think he probably does find people, and you do have some of these more dubious characters who've changed sides several times during the Civil War get good careers early on, and it's sort of still in the 20s BC, but as time passes, you just don't see those names anymore. Those families aren't continuing through. So it may well be that he's realized, well, I needed you then, but you're really not what I want now. And he's quite careful about his selection of magistrates, of consuls, of advisors, but also trying to show respect to the Senate. So he does a lot that is meant to sort of make it easier for everyone to accept the fact that, okay, we're going to pretend that I'm not effectively a military dictator, that I don't control all the army, but let's just pretend that isn't the case, and let's just pretend we're all citizens, we're all serving again, and I will act as if that's true, and I will behave, and I will restrain myself, and I will also work really hard. He does a lot. He's a very busy man right up to his last days. He's away from Rome more often than he's there. He's touring the provinces. He's listening to petition after petition, speech after speech of people who want something from him, trying to get the administration going again. So there's a lot of slog in this as well. But I suspect there is. One of the problems is often we only know the names of some of the people he chooses. So it's hard to know, is he always choosing well? How many mistakes does he make? There are people who clearly don't live up to and of course you have the classic example, AD 9, where the man he appoints to govern the province beyond the Rhine in Germany leads his army into an ambush, gets 3 legions slaughtered. That's clearly a bad choice. But then we don't know what the pool was at that time, how much talent there was around. So it's often difficult to reconstruct the details.
Yeah, I like that picture you painted quite a bit for the layers of it. Of it's the context, to bring it back around to the beginning again. The context of the two individuals draws a lot of what they were able to even do. The context of Caesar and the king of the hill that was happening at the time, and then ultimately the civil war that maintained into Augustus's time, where people just were exhausted and they just wanted an end to it, which obviously he capitalized on, but it's as much drawn from the context that surrounded them is what they were able to do with it. And also the lack of, other evidence as to the history of what was going around Augustus and the individuals, maybe that gives us a little bit different view of the two of them. Hanging on that a little bit, do you think that Augustus was, a genius intellect, and how much does the inability to solve the secession part of it tarnish his legacy? If at all, or does it is it something that only kind of takes on later on, and as the time goes through, and you have Nero and Caligula, and then you have the Flavians, then it kind of just becomes this mad scramble of roulette of who's going to be the next emperor?
He's clearly bright. He's very capable, and as I say, he seems to be able to understand his own limitations. And so, he's not a great military commander, but he finds people like Agrippa and others who are, and makes them loyal to him. But you get, you look at his early life, you've got, for instance, the whole, we tend to forget that Livia, who, again, we know more through the sort of Robert Graves I Claudia stuff as Caligula called her, Ulysses in a dress, this schemer, this intrigue who might possibly murder half a family. When he marries her, she's pregnant with Drusus, her son. She's married to somebody else, and he makes that man divorce her, waits until she gives birth, and then a couple of days later marries her and gets the former husband to sort of act in place of her father and give her away at the ceremony. Then has a feast where they all dress up as gods and goddesses at a time of famine in Rome. This is we're getting into Nero country here and crazy emperor stuff, but of course he's only in his 20s. He and his friends are riding really high. Everything they've done so far has succeeded spectacularly well. So in a sense, it's not surprising, but he's able to learn from that and moderate it so that later you get the stories that from, early on, he was very, very, very keen on executing people when they came before him for judgment. Moriendum esse, you must die. To the point where advisors would come and say, look, you've done enough today. You need to calm down a bit. And the Romans found that very disturbing because they felt he was too young to have made enough enemies to want to hate so many people. That was, if you were older, maybe you had reasons for it, but they didn't like the idea of somebody young being vicious. Later in life, you get the story that whenever he felt his temper was building up, that he'd stop and recite the alphabet to himself silently in his head before answering, just to sort of give himself that deep breath, calm down. Or occasion where he ran out of the Senate and left it because he thought, if I make a speech now, it'll be really powerful, but I'll regret everything I say. So you have this, and he'll advise Tiberius, don't worry what people say about you, just worry about what they do. So I think he's somebody very good at learning. And from that, and that's quite a skill, because it's all very well being bright and thinking I know everything, but actually if you can try things and then go, okay, that doesn't work, let's move on from there. So a lot of it comes through. The succession issue is a difficult one because he's the first, we don't really know what's in his mind. Now, very clearly, everybody anticipates there being another princeps after Augustus, and they're looking from early on to see who's this going to be, and I want to be friendly with this person so that I do well under their regime. But I even wonder, I mean, this is something that's only come to me since I wrote the book. It is quite striking that he has Agrippa with him for a while. He gives him a version of his own powers. He'll do the same to other family members as it goes through. That could be marking them out as a success, or it might even be that he's got this idea in mind of there being more than one emperor, of there almost being a college of 2 or 3, which is what, an idea that'll be revisited in the late antiquity, because there's so much to do and the empire is so big. I don't know. It's in the same way you have these stories that once or twice he thought about resigning, retiring from public life. It does seem clear. I mean, looking with hindsight, you can't help thinking that the Senate would only have torn things apart again if you'd put them back in charge. And by the time you get to the assassination of Caligula, that's the only time where for a few hours the Senate sits down and debates, should we basically go back to the old days, sort of pre-Caesar, pre-Augustus, elected consuls every year. And even the Senate, within a matter of hours, says, no, that isn't going to work, so let's just choose the best one of us to be emperor. By that time, the Praetorian Guard have found Claudius, proclaimed him emperor, so it's all done and dusted. But again, because we know it, in the same way, Tiberius will succeed Augustus, but Tiberius by this time is an old man. He's slogged for years, fighting wars, administering provinces, doing all this sort of thing. He's had this bad marriage with Augustus' daughter Julia. He's gone into voluntary retirement when only middle-aged, to Rhodes for a few years. You feel he doesn't want to rule as Augustus ruled. And whereas Augustus spends most of his reign away from Italy, Tiberius not only stays in Italy, but after a while he leaves Rome and then eventually goes to Capri and becomes sort of, quite reclusive, difficult to access, which is the opposite to the Augustan model of walking through the streets of Rome, letting people come up, talk to you, present petitions, this sort of contact, dining with other senators, being, attending the Senate regularly, and also touring the provinces, doing things there, meeting people there, talking to people. It's very much a emphasis on face-to-face encounters. But we tend to think of emperors as people who stay in Rome and sit there basically, but that's really only from Tiberius onwards. So there's quite a radical change. So some of what we assume Augustus established actually may have more to do with the way Tiberius does things, which to some extent is influenced by the fact that he's an elderly man without the energy, without the inclination to do this sort of thing anymore. And he doesn't have, unlike Augustus, he doesn't have the equivalent of himself and his brother. He doesn't have relatives, trusted advisors that can go and do the job for him, because they're nearly all dead by this time.
Yeah, he also didn't seem to be as savvy with the poets and writers of the time, because they seem to slander him quite a bit. That's fascinating. The other thing that I never thought of until this moment is it seems like the emperors that get the rap of doing the greatest job seem to be the ones that spent the littlest amount of time in Rome. I mean, you have Hadrian and Marcus Aurelius and some other folks who seem to spend less of their time there. And I think even the fact that Augustus spent such little time isn't as widely known, at least in the pop culture of today, which seems like ancient Rome is having a bit of a renaissance.
It's partly because when historians talk about him, we tend to focus on the institutions. This is the system he created. This is how he did things. When I wrote a biography, which is not such a fashionable thing to do academically these days, in a biography, you're more interested in where is this person at any one time? What are they doing? And then you start to work it out and you realize that Hadrian comes close to traveling as much as Augustus, but Augustus visits almost the entire empire. And as I say, spends so much time, even when he's quite advanced. But again, Hadrian is a contrast because in the modern day, he is thought of as a good emperor, but he was absolutely hated at the time, partly because, again, he didn't have... It's one thing, and you can see this in leaders today. So many of them have that ability to just get on with people, to be friendly, make people talk, make people feel at ease. Augustus clearly had this. He's the only emperor where we have a collection of his jokes preserved. And they're not desperately funny in many cases, but they are all about he could laugh at himself, this sort of thing. So you have that. It was all about, if you look, I mean, in another context, think of Eisenhower in the Second World War as Supreme Commander. He probably wasn't the greatest battlefield general, and that wasn't his experience. But that smile and that ability just to get on with these difficult personalities like Patton, like Montgomery, like so many of these prima donnas you had out there, you think, how could anybody else have done that job so well? Augustus has that sort of easy charm. It's not quite the Caesar charisma, but he just gets on with people. Tiberius utterly lacks that, and some of the others do. Ultimately, it's how the Senate feels about you will affect how you're remembered, because they're the ones who write the history. It's written by them and for them. So if you upset them, and Hadrian did that because he was a clever man who knew he was clever and made sure everybody else had to know this. So you have the story where he's arguing with a philosopher, corrects this man about some expression, and the philosopher just goes along with it. And when asked why afterwards, he said, well, you don't argue with someone who controls 30 legions. You couldn't. An architect who mocks him repeatedly ends up getting executed. Hadrian just had this, he was just a bit too, had to have the last word, he had to be right, he had to make sure, whereas Augustus is more concerned with the end result and making it all function and doesn't really care so much about those little things. So it comes back again to something that's so easy to lose when we study history, because it tends to get dismissed as, well, this is just the popular end of things. And scholars want to look at the underlying causes, what's going on. But personalities really matter, just as they do in our daily lives. The same historians who will complain about their head of department because of some quirk in his or her behavior will then deny that could matter with any Roman emperor or leader. It's, they're human beings. And some people have that knack that they can get away with things, and others can do far less, but they're just loathed or disdained or whatever it might be. So all of these things are still there in the ancient world. It's just that they're just people.
Yeah, human nature. I mean, there's a great sociological book, The Elephant in the Brain, which I bring up any chance I get. It's a fascinating book, but what's making me think of is how self-aware Augustus was in knowing people's, way that they'll even talk to him because of what you brought up with Hadrian. Like, it's you're going to laugh at your boss's jokes even if they're not funny, but an awareness of that to try to relax them in such a way that you're able to serve them, I guess, in a way. But really what he's doing it for is almost like to subvert the order and make something that's, I mean, I guess peaceful. And I don't know if necessarily peace was his aim, but it's really his talent was his grit and ability to learn and continue to be aware of human nature, I guess is the way we're talking about it, as well as what his aims were. You mentioned like the Senate arguing like should we make this into a republic that it was before. And I think I heard it from your conversation in the Told Stone podcast about how the Parthian Empire, once Rome became an empire, much preferred dealing with the imperial Rome as opposed to the republic, because it was so much more predictable. When it was a republic, it was unpredictable. A new person would come in and try to get glory and seek it out for themselves, and then it would be, everything would be upside again. And obviously, people are always in Rome were always eyeing the Parthian Empire as a means to get glory. Given the nature of political instability, and it may not even be unique to that aspect of Rome and Roman culture when it comes to democracies, given that they had this almost the Mediterranean as a Roman lake by the time, Augustus comes into the fold, do you think the slide into a more imperial, empire or monarchy was inevitable? Especially given that the turning point with even Marius and Sulla before Caesar was already kind of bending in that way, or do you think that? So, in summing it up, do you think that the slide into empire was inevitable, or was it something that potentially could have been altered in some other different way?
I think it was always likely, perhaps, rather than inevitable. Again, we tend to take it for granted that the empire is going to survive and prosper and not fragment. because you do have, I mean, the old idea is that you have a 12-month political cycle. So every year you elect your new consuls, you have two of them, so they balance each other out. They go off for 12 months or so, do their stuff, win glory, and then somebody else takes over. That's fine, but as the empire gets bigger, it's just harder and harder to deal with problems, whether it's settling an area or let alone fighting a war against a big opponent. It just doesn't tend to finish in 12 months. And you could see with any system where somebody just has a short spell in a job, they spend the first weeks or months learning how to do it, finding out about it. They then get good. By the time they're starting to get good, you've replaced them with somebody else and you go through the same process again. I remember talking to a chap who'd been a commander in the Fleet Auxiliary, which is sort of supports the Royal Navy. Now, they stay on the same ship for years and years and tend to be experienced, the ship's captains, whereas the Royal Navy changed every time. So he'd repeatedly done an exercise in Norway where they landed the Royal Marines and others in extreme conditions in the Arctic. And he said every year at the end of the exercise, you'd have the same debriefing because everybody had made exactly the same mistakes because it was a new batch of people. And you just sort of sat there listening to that. But again, it's human nature. So there is a problem. That limited term, particularly when it's all based around just 1 year, it's very hard to deal with things. So that meant that the rise of Marius, Sulla, people like that, Pompey, Caesar, and other, someone you could send off, give responsibility. There's a sense with when the people vote Pompey, these big commands, they just want the whole problem dealt with, whether it's piracy in the Mediterranean, whether it's Mithridates of Pontus, give somebody power, give somebody you trust, who's good, and say, go off, do this for us. So I think it's inclining that way. But it didn't need to have been as successful as people like Augustus could make it, because Augustus, he creates that system of stability. He gets people in Italy, gets the Senate to accept this, but he also gets everybody in the provinces as well. And then they do that uniquely Roman thing of making the provinces Roman, starting with the elites, but the way you spread Roman citizenship so that it has not even the slightest ethnic connection with Italy, let alone Rome. But you're a Roman. Legally, you've got that status. And if you've got enough money, if you've got the right connections, you can have a political career. So, Julius Caesar introduces a few Gauls to the Senate. More will come. You'll end up with emperors like Trajan and Hadrian from Spain, Septimius Severus from North Africa, and they're Roman. Nobody's that bothered about where they've actually grown up because they're a Roman senator, just like anybody else. So it didn't have to be as successful as that. And some of those things are the reason why it lasts so long and has such a deep impact on subsequent culture.
Yeah, that's interesting. The slide being likely is also interesting, and as well as the military example that you gave. I studied in Taiwan for a while, and one of the things that comes up all the time in U.S. Taiwanese relations, it's still one today, is they have conscription in Taiwan where everyone has to join the army for a year. And one of the things the United States is always trying to push them is, can you do a professional army? Because by the time this equipment's really hard to learn, and by the time everything gets in there, it's not the greatest. Where if you have professionals, you're going to have people who know what they're doing time in and time out. They're actually stand up better. So with that kind of, once again, bit of human nature, it's interesting to think of the shift towards something more centralized, and with an individual at the head that can be dealing with these issues is probably likely. I mean, given the crises that were happening with land reform and rights and all of that from time immemorial, maybe even extending Roman citizenship to the peninsula would have happened faster if it was somebody that was in a more administrative capacity. That's an interesting thing to ponder.
There's a wonderful story about Augustus that's told by the geographer Strabo, and he talks about Strabo, this Greek, being on a ship sailing past one of the tiniest of the Greek islands. And he cites this community on there, that's just a fishing village or two, as the poorest people in the Roman Empire, the poorest people in the world. And their entire tax for the community is sort of lower than the price of a cow in Roman Egypt at the time. That's it. But one of these fishermen comes on board their ship to travel to Corinth because he's heard that Augustus is there, and they'd like their tribute reduced a bit because they can't afford to pay it. But this man believes, who's come from the least important community in the entire empire, that he can go to Corinth, he can queue up, and eventually the emperor will see him, or somebody will deal with this problem, whether he'll get an answer or not. That's the system that Augustus creates, which just hadn't existed at all in the Republic, where governors came and went. They were all mostly out for a fast buck anyway, and unless you could bribe them, you weren't going to get anything. And then the next one would come along and reverse the decision unless you bribed him as well, and so on and so on. That sense that everybody now has someone that can answer their questions, deal with their problems. It comes back to this idea that meant that somebody like Augustus and all the diligent emperors work very long, very dull hours because they're listening to all sorts of stuff. And there's a terrible backlog. I mean, it takes ages to get through all of this, but the theory is that eventually someone will actually resolve each of these, will answer every question, every petition that's made. And it's trying to extend this very personal way of dealing with things, but doing it on an empire-wide basis. And that's a remarkable achievement.
Yeah, it seems the gravity towards it makes a lot of sense. I mean, as you said, there was the tradition of like patronage and clients, and serving somebody in the aristocracy, and currying favors, but it's only as good as that person still mattered, and they didn't get taken out by some other rivalry that was going on. Where if you have a system in place, it seems more stable. It also seems a bit of like a gravitational pull towards it, where you seek it out because even in the example you said about the Parthians and that podcast, it's more predictable. Throughout ancient Rome, both the Republic and the Empire, even like Byzantium, which even at the time of Venice was known as Romania. So it's, we think of it as the Byzantine Empire, but it was really the Eastern Roman Empire in some form, when you want to say that stopped. But it's a bit of, like I was saying, a bit of a resurgence these days with the interest in that time of history. And if you were given some kind of magic wand and we were transported back to that time period, because there's a bit of a romance, if it's from the Gladiator movie, or I guess movies now, or the show Rome, or in people reading, there's a bit of a romance of projecting our own time back onto it and saying, oh my God, they're so much like us. But if we were to kind of transport it back there, would we at all recognize what we were seeing, and how much of a culture shock would we truly be having? There's obviously the bits of human nature like politics and whatnot that we would find familiar, but would we at all recognize this as a place we'd want to live?
I think, Hollywood's tended to give us Rome of gleaming white marble, or I think, in the original Gladiator movie, it was all sort of quite grey, and now it seems more of a sandstone, limestone. It's a lighter in the sequel one. I don't quite know why they've changed the palette, but it's all quite grand. Whereas you're dealing with a city of 1 million people, and even though it has got sewers, it's got water and all these supplies, nevertheless, that's 1 million people crammed into a very small area. Some of the poorer parts of the city, they're probably more like Mumbai or Calcutta or someone like that today, that just teeming mass of humanity, much of it dirt poor, that's struggling. So I suspect the smell of Rome would strike us because we're used to, the softer things of today. And the casual cruelty. The acceptance of slavery is just something normal. That's just natural. Nobody ever really argues that you should change this. It's just you don't want to be a slave if you can help it. And there's no ethnic element to it. Anybody can be a slave if they get captured or whatever it might be. So there's a lot that's very different. There's a lot. The other thing, of course, that the Hollywood has tended to give us is a very sort of pure image of Rome in terms of statues are always just bare marble. Know that none of the buildings are painted. There isn't the colour, the gaudiness. The HBO Rome series did this a bit. It gave that sort of look to it, but that's also trying to show you Rome before Augustus has really found it brick and left it marble, that sort of thing. So it's quite as grand then. But a lot of statues were painted, and the painters were almost as famous as the sculptors in many cases, the works of art. And of course, you can see it a little bit from Pompeii, Herculaneum, some other sites. Inside, even moderately affluent people, your house is a mass of colour. You've got wall paintings, you've got scenes, you've got this. So there's smells, there's sights, everything is a lot stronger, perhaps. But beyond that, I suspect, again, it's like traveling to another country and seeing another culture today. A lot is shocking, but after a while, you start to see all the connections as well. So it's a mixture, but there's so much. The other thing, again, we tend to forget is the Roman Empire is truly huge, just looking on a map. I think it stretches from what's now southern Scotland right the way out to down the Nile, beyond Egypt, to the Euphrates and beyond. It's huge, but that's even huger when the fastest anyone can travel is galloping a horse or sailing a ship. And that's true of any news. There's no, you can send very basic signals by flag, smoke, this sort of thing. But basically, any message has to be carried. And yet, there are these aspects of modernity about it. You can see fashions in shoes, for instance. You can see them. Someone like Vindolanda, south of Hadrian's Wall, they found thousands of Roman shoes preserved. The styles are the same as the ones you can find on sites in Egypt. And within a sort of decade or so, everybody in the empire seems to stop wearing one type and wear another. You see it with hairstyles, that the women of the imperial family, their hairstyles are copied, and you see this spreading. So it's that very odd mixture of everything's quite slow, but it's also very much like a modern world in that you suspect not only are people wearing the same clothes, they're probably singing some of the same songs and tunes in Britain as they are out east. I mean, there's a tombstone from another site just south of Hadrian's Wall to a woman called Regina. Now, she's from a tribe of Britons that are from just north of the River Thames, so southern England. So that's not that far, it's a few hundred miles away. But she's been a slave. She's libertar et coniuge, freed woman and wife. Now, her husband is a chap called Barates, who's come from the city of Palmyra, which is all the way out there in Syria. And he's now active, possibly as a soldier, possibly as a merchant. Perhaps he's been one and now become the other, up in northern Britain, thousands of miles away. And while she's depicted as this Roman matron wearing a sort of formal dress, the inscription's in Latin, until the last line, when it's in the Palmyrene language, which runs right to left rather than left to right. And it adds the inscription, Regina, the wife of Barates, alas. So people are moving around. You've got these ideas that can be. So there's aspects where this is reminiscent of the modern world. There are some things it's just done with different technology, different ideas, different ways of doing things. But there's something remarkable about this being so large and lasting so long and mixing people together in this way.
Yeah, almost like the signature of an imperial pseudo-industrial society tends to look similar enough that maybe there's aspects of it that we would be able to understand. It's funny, I actually intentionally stopped myself from leading you with the smell, but that's the thing that like I always think back on, like of how, I mean, our other than getting inundated with fragrances all the time, our modern world is quite sterile compared to what it would have been back then, and I would imagine that would be quite a shock. I mean, I'm not your stepping stone. It was a reason that there was that song of being able to just step over the shit in the streets.
Well, that's the thing, and we even think we tend to, if you go back to sort of Jane Austen's world and that sort of thing, when you actually think, how often did those people get to wash in quite the way, and how often do you clean your clothes and iron your clothes and do all of these things that we take for granted because the technology has made it so simple? And yes, they probably were pretty clean and tried to be, and hence the emphasis on a gentleman wearing gloves, having these sort of white or light-coloured breeches, shows the fact that you're wearing new clothes, wearing fresh clothes a lot. But the 18th century, before that, you'd had all the use of powdered wigs and hair powder and this to hide the fact that your hair was pretty filthy. So it's again, these sometimes we just, and of course, whenever we do the Hollywood version of any history, inevitably we put modern looking people and we assume lots of the modern ways of doing things because we don't want to make it look too bad or just too alien to us.
Right. Yeah. You want to try to bridge that divide a bit. With that kind of setup, if we were to say that ancient Rome never existed, would our Western society be at all recognizable? Like, what's the lasting impact of ancient Rome and to today?
It's immense because obviously it brings in, through the Romans, we get so much of the Greek tradition that's influenced the way we think about just about everything, apart from the language, apart from the fact that it's, the Greek alphabet is the first one that's essentially phonetic and that you can adapt to write any language, which then it turns into the Latin alphabet, but can be turned into anything else rather than representing sounds and syllables in the more complicated way that where you have to know the language to be able to understand it. But let's face it, we're recording this in December, which you think it's called the 10th month. And the reason it's called the 10th month is because originally the Romans had 10 until Caesar reforms the calendar from a lunar cycle to a solar cycle. But you need December because that's formally the end of the political year. And there are festivals and there are occasions. That's when, 31st of December is when the consuls lay down their power. They're still going to do that. So you move it to be our 12th month. And we just don't think of these things the same way, you don't consciously in July think, oh, yeah, this is named after Caesar or August after all. But we've got September, October, November, December out of sequence as far, or at least out of logic. They're too behind what they should be. So much of it, the Romans influenced so many things, and a lot of it's indirect because then, of course, you could say even with the Judeo-Christian tradition, because of the Catholic Church, because the Pope becomes Pontifex Maximus, takes on the same title that Caesar had, takes on the structure that in Europe, at least, the dioceses are laid out on Roman provincial administrative lines that preserve that afterwards. So there's just this shadow that goes a very, very long way in lots of areas where we don't expect it. So it was a crucial period. No other power in history has controlled all the lands around the Mediterranean. And even though there have been bigger empires than the Romans since then, there's still something to have controlled such a large section of the earth and its population for such a long time. And the world would be unimaginably different. You can't just knock out a few things and think, oh yeah, we do this, we do that. It's so much depends on that Greco-Roman tradition.
Yeah, it always fascinates me how much it's pervasive everywhere. I mean, from the laws in America, you can pretty much have a direct line back to Roman laws to the way we build our state capitals. I mean, there's a painting that I always think of George Washington, which is essentially invoking Aeneas. It's all very tied in. It's interesting to think of how it wouldn't be recognizable or even the same thing whatsoever. I want to ask you one last question, which is, what's your favorite aspect of ancient history and Rome in particular? What do you find that can still spark such curiosity or joy in you, given how much time you've spent with the subject?
Well, I remember a friend at university saying, whatever you say about the Romans, they're never dull. You wouldn't want them to live next door to you, but they're exciting to look at. I don't know. I think one of the reasons I'm drawn to ancient history is you can get to the sort of coal face of history much faster because there's less information. There are fewer sources. So even as a student, even as an amateur, you can look at a topic and you can read all the evidence for it quite relatively quickly, and then you can start to think about that, and basically you're following in the footsteps of the most eminent historian who's ever done that, in a way you can't even with, say, medieval history. The frustrating side of that, of course, is that then there are lots of things that we can't resolve. We'd love to know more, and we can't. There's just not the evidence there. You can't push it beyond that point. So it's a mixture, but I think it comes back to that never dull bit. There's something, I find all of history fascinating. And if I, visit anywhere and there's some historical connection, I can very easily just get distracted and start wanting to read about that and follow that up. It's just, people are interesting. That's what history is about. I keep coming back to the Romans. There's something about them that, apart from being important, it is spectacular. I mean, there's an element. Somebody like Caesar is a natural showman. Augustus the same. And there's something about Roman society. I mean, you don't have to build roads as obsessively straight as that, but it looks good. And if you look at many of the aqueducts, the ones we remember are the big ones up on arches. Often there'll be a late Roman one, a Byzantine one, that's just a tunnel at ground level that's almost as efficient, if not as efficient, but it doesn't look good. This is a society that wants to tell you, not only are we doing this for you, but we're going to remind you that we're giving you this water and show off. So there's something exuberant about them. They're as I say, they're not dull. They're fun. They're fun to observe from a safe distance.
As you would probably want with them if you were a contemporary. Their exuberance is interesting. I've never thought of it quite that way, but now I'm wondering if part of their being founded by outlaws and
Mm.
essentially having a bit of a inferiority complex, perhaps in the beginning, kind of shown through, and they kept with their. I mean, even the fact that the way that they were, your families would, you wouldn't just be achieving glory for yourself, but essentially your whole lineage going forward. And if you were the first person, you're a new man, and that's something it's I don't even know if it was you would know better if it was lauded, but it was at least noted that you were the first one that was really rising to something like Cicero or whatnot. So their means of being a bit showman and a bit grand, I guess, it makes them all the more romantic. And they also, like as you said, definitely let you know it. And they were just what was it like? I think Dan Carlin, another podcaster, he had a line about how Roman legionaries were so effective because they were some part engineer, some part warrior. They seemed like they were able to do both of those, and how even if they were going to make a fort for a few days, they would still make sure it was laid out in a certain way, and took such tedium to it. Maybe that's perhaps why their legacy is so enduring, let alone the fact of the influence on our time.
Well, Latin's a very precise language. You've got future perfect tenses and this sort of thing, and it's not surprising that they gave us this legal heritage for good or bad, but also that sense. Greek is a wonderful language for concepts, for abstract ideas, and this sort of thing, which is probably why when you get with the church later on, they start arguing about the nature of the Trinity. It's so complicated because the Latin is this instinct, right? That's it. I've made it clear. That's exactly what that word means. You can't argue. Whereas the Greek concepts are much broader, but the Romans get things done. I was interested a few years ago. I was in Spain near Toledo and visiting some people, friends of my brothers, and one of them was in the military academy there, where they would train Spanish officers. We went out on the training area, and he showed us where he normally camped and put up his sort of little bivouac, his basho, we'd call it, and it was next to part of a Roman aqueduct. And because it was broken open, you could actually see where they channeled the water. So the pipe changed, it dropped down, and the pipe changed diameter to create pressure, which then allowed it to go uphill to reach the top of the town, which was the other side of the valley higher up. And it's just that ability to get things to work that's quite staggering about that. There is that engineering knack, but with as I say, a lot of showing off about it as well. As I say, they don't have to do that with the building camps, but they do because that's how you do it, and that shows we're Roman. There's something there about them that they are. It isn't coincidence that they had this empire that lasted so long, whereas the Greeks spend all their time bickering with each other and arguing with each other, competing, and give us this idea of the Olympic Games and proving your excellence and all this sort of thing. But the Romans have that knack of working together, even when they go through these violent periods. It's there's just something different about them. And the fact that there's something interesting as well of that willingness to, when you have a slave, you free them, they become a Roman citizen. No other culture does that. And within a generation or two, they're indistinguishable. In Nero's reign, one of the senators will say, well, frankly, we're all descended from slaves somewhere or other. We just don't talk about it much. It's that acceptance of it. So they're interesting people.
Yeah, the tie-in with the language I think is fascinating. I don't think I ever had quite thought about that with Latin, but I mean, Hungarian is a very logical language, and there's no doubt. When I was in Hungary, that was one of the things that some of the folks over there were talking to me about. They're like, it's no wonder why so many composers and mathematicians, or like John von Neumann, all come from Hungary, because the language is so logical. I think that has a type of influence. I mean, think of English. I mean, English is, I think it's John McWhorter said, it's the magnificent bastard tongue. There's no doubt of why so much great literature has been written in English, because it's got so much French vocabulary, and you still have the Germanic roots, but you kind of get rid of all these weird tensing that has to happen in it, but you can still anglicize pretty much any word. And I mean, it's no wonder Joseph Conrad, who was, he spoke like 5 languages, but his native tongue was Polish, was able to write something like The Heart of Darkness, which is just beautifully precise prose, but in such a way where I feel like he never reuses an adjective or an analogy. He's able to just keep pulling from all these different places. And, even the way that we use, we tend to use French grammar if we want to be more formal, and, German grammar and German words if we want to be a little more informal. It's interesting to think of how that ends up pervading into the culture and I guess into the history even.
I think it does. It's how you express affects how you think, and something that is adaptable seems to extend into other walks of life as well. That somehow you just seem to be able to do that, and as you say, other people can take it and use it as well. Even so, it's and that's Latin probably has that role for a long time, and of course, yes, English does to an even greater degree now. And it's because it's relatively easy to learn, which makes a difference. But,
yeah, relatively easy to learn, a little difficult to master because of all the contextual little idiosyncrasies. Like when I was in Taiwan and talking to folks out there doing a language exchange, they would always say like they didn't understand sarcasm because the means of expressing that in English was always so subtle. But hey, it was awesome talking with you. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. We can pause the recording in a moment, but I'll always give you the option if there's anything else you wanted to say or plug before we hit stop on the recording.
No, not really. I haven't got a book out for a while yet. I've got a YouTube channel if anybody's interested. Just search for Adrian Goldsworthy and you'll find it. So if you want to hear me rambling at greater length, I do it there. But or my website, adriangoldsworthy.com, gives the basic details of the books and that sort of thing. So what I've actually written.
Excellent.
Occasionally in enough advance to say I'm speaking somewhere and doing that if people want to come along and see.
Well, certainly, I'll make sure to put that in the show notes as well. But thank you again.